More states are acquiring nuclear weapons or developing the technology to build them. A terrorist organization would need no more than one or two of those weapons or the material to make them to throw our planet into chaos. The danger is very, very real. We are at a nuclear tipping point, and the actions being taken are not adequate to the threat.
Over the long term, we need to be heading towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And over the short term, we need to be taking the steps to reduce the danger that the nuclear weapons we already have could be used. This is such an important problem in my mind that it dwarfs all other considerations.
The way I view it is that if you view the goal of getting to zero as the top of the mountain in terms of nuclear weapons, then we can't even see the top of the mountain today. We're heading down, we're not heading up. It's going to take a long time to see the top of the mountain, but I think we have an obligation to our children and to our grandchildren to build paths up the mountain, to get other people to go up the mountain with us, because this cannot be unilateral.
We don't quite know what the mountaintop will look like. We don't quite know how to get to that mountaintop. And we won't make any proposals that we cannot justify, but we are determined to go up that mountaintop.
A man named Max Kampelman, who had been my counselor when I was Secretary of State, made an eloquent statement emphasizing the importance of talking about what ought to be. If you're constantly mired in what is, and you never look at what ought to be, you're never going to really get anywhere. And he used the Declaration of Independence as an example. All men are created equal. In 1776, are you kidding? We had slaves. Women couldn't vote. You had to have property in order to vote. We had the ought up there. And gradually, over time, often with a lot of pain and agony and difficulty, but gradually, the is has come closer to the ought.
Once nuclear weapons are used, we will be driven to take global measures to prevent it. So some of us have said, let's ask ourselves, if we have to do it afterwards, why don't we do it now?
It is my pleasure and indeed honor to kick off this event. My colleague Keir Lieber couldn't be here today, but I will be replacing him, making some opening remarks. We have some of the most distinguished names in the field of nuclear security and arms control here with us today. When Senators Nunn and Lugar started the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the conventional wisdom was that terrorists wanted a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Al-Qaeda proved that to be wrong. They proved that they wanted a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead. The group's efforts to develop a nuclear capability took its members all over the map, from Sudan to Afghanistan. They tried to get hold of fissile material and warheads. They even managed to conduct a crude test of conventional explosives for their nuclear program. Fortunately, their success was limited. CTR has certainly contributed to this. Its impressive track record includes the deactivation of thousands of warheads, the repatriation and safeguard of fissile material, the conversion of facilities, the neutralization of chemical weapons, and the mitigation of biothreats. But from Japan to Chechnya, several terrorist groups have expressed an interest in nuclear weapons. Today, with the Islamic State controlling huge areas in Iraq, we should all be thankful that the highly enriched uranium and radiological sources in that country were removed after the First and Second Persian Gulf Wars. And 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, reports are surfacing again, predicting a collapse of the Russian Federation and the danger of loose nukes in a country with thousands of nuclear weapons stored in an estimated 40 facilities around Russia's huge territory. This is why nuclear terrorism has been identified as one of the core challenges to the world by the UN and the President of the United States, who started the Nuclear Security Summit initiative, of which the last installment will be in 2016. But a lot more has to be done. Fortunately, our distinguished panelists today are working hard to make sure that nuclear materials and facilities don't fall in the wrong hands. Senators Nunn and Lugar set a model of bipartisan effort to mitigate one of the key challenges facing the United States and the world. This model is one for Congress to follow. It has to play a very important role in providing the solution to this key challenge. Other key players here are organizations established by our panelists and others. The Lugar Center, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which had the video that you just saw, the Carnegie Endowment, and the Congress Nuclear Security Caucus. Before handing it over to see what has been done and what still needs to be done, I would like to thank a few people. Let me start by the Georgetown University Office of Federal Relations, the School of Foreign Service Security Studies Program, the International Relations Club for hosting this, and a number of student groups around campus, the Georgetown Reserve Officers Training Corps, College Republicans, College Democrats, and the Alumni Association DC Club. Last but not least, I would like to thank Congressman Fortenberry and his staff for the vision for this conference. At the School of Foreign Service, we share the Congressman's vision that the study of nuclear security and the pursuit of nuclear threat reduction remain critically important. We need to develop future practitioners, scholars, and leaders who are well-versed in the challenges of nuclear security and who pursue work in this field in the future. I certainly hope that my own students who are here tonight from my Iran and the bomb class specifically are to think about these issues and explore them. Let me just say one more thing before I hand it over. We are going to give priority tonight to our students, this being a campus event. Of course, if we have time, we will get to other questions as well. And on this note, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Do-Yeon Kim from the Carnegie Endowment, who's here tonight and who will be moderating this panel.
Thanks, Ariane, and thank you, Dave Maxwell with Georgetown University, wherever you are, for inviting me to moderate this very important discussion with our distinguished speakers tonight, and for those who we are very grateful for your continued service on this very important topic. I'd also like to thank Congressman Fortenberry for being the driver of tonight's discussion, like Ariane just mentioned, and for trying to get young adults and the general public more interested in nuclear and nuclear security issues. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an ongoing concern that non-state actors might steal or illicitly purchase highly enriched uranium or plutonium, use them to construct an improvised nuclear device and wreak havoc on mankind, or sabotage nuclear facilities to yield the same results. Really? Well, sure, it sounds like a low probability event, in which it is, but it's definitely a high-risk, devastating scenario. Ambassador Robert Gallucci calls this a black swan event. He has said, quote, "People might say the scenario of nuclear terrorism is too much like a fictional disaster movie, but not that long ago, that's what they said about the possibility of someone deliberately flying an aircraft into a skyscraper," unquote. I and our distinguished speakers tonight are convinced of the nuclear terrorism problem and threat, but are you? If not, we hope so by the end of tonight's discussion, and help us solve this problem. Or at the very least, I hope that you can walk away from tonight's discussion thinking about it, researching it, and asking more questions about it. There has been significant progress to reduce nuclear terrorism, the nuclear terrorism threat, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Ariane has given us a brief historical timeline from then until the present day with the Nuclear Security Summit process. Tonight, we will unpack the nuclear terrorism threat and the global cooperation needed to ensure that the world is safer in the 21st century for all of us here tonight and for generations to come. We will begin the discussion on nuclear materials security and work our way to a discussion in the second half of the program on nuclear weapons. Now, we have an excellent panel this evening, 4 esteemed gentlemen who need no introduction. And so let's just get right to it. Gentlemen, on nuclear materials security, how real is a nuclear terrorism threat really? Are we just crying wolf?
Well, let me just say that there are at least 10 nations that have nuclear materials presently and that have not renounced their idea of developing those materials into weapons. It was a very dramatic article that many of us read yesterday in the Washington Post about South Africa. And we have negotiated with South Africa, by we, I mean the international community, a great deal. But leadership there believes, for various reasons, that it must keep about 485 pounds, as I understand it, of highly enriched uranium that might make a couple of weapons. That's a small example of this, but with Sam Nunn and Des Browne, the Nuclear Threat Initiative has taken a look at as many as 25 countries on Earth that still have nuclear materials. There used to be much more like 50. And through diligent activity, frequently with partnership of the United States and Russia, a lot of that material has been scooped out and taken away for a variety of reasons and under sometimes unusual circumstances. But there's a lot out there. And I mentioned the will of these 10 countries because they're not eager to get rid of it. As a matter of fact, they believe for their own foreign policy purposes that they want to retain it for various reasons. Now this means that this material has all of the problems of safeguards that are present wherever this may be, whether it be in the United States or in Russia or so forth. There are people on this earth that are eager to get their hands on it, eager to make something of it. Even as I've heard physicians talk about, just by banging stuff together, you could create an enormous explosion, quite apart from the sophistication of aircraft or submarines or so forth. So this is a very serious problem, and I just mentioned these facts at least to get a start on it tonight.
Thank you, Senator.
As usual, I agree with my partner, Dick Lugar. This is not a piece of cake. To have a terrorist group get nuclear materials, put it together, make a crude weapon, deliver it in a truck of some sort. We're not talking about something that's going to fly through space on an ICBM or be delivered by a bomber. So it's not a piece of cake. But the consequences are so severe that you have to take it very, very seriously. And I think we have moved into an era that I call a perfect storm era in terms of willingness of a group to use a crude nuclear weapon if they had it. The technological know-how, which governments back in the 50s and 60s did not think would be in the possession of individuals, is now in the possession of individuals and groups. It's available. People know how to make a nuclear weapon. Not easy, not a piece of cake. So those are 2 of the ingredients. The third ingredient is the nuclear material to make a weapon. And as Dick Lugar mentioned, much of the efforts of governments has to be to protect that material. It's either plutonium or it's highly enriched uranium. That's the hardest part for a terrorist group, to be able to get possession of that material. Certainly very hard to produce it. Plutonium has to be reprocessed. Uranium has to have large centrifuges. So stealing it or buying it is the most likely. And so this means that the world, not just the United States, but we've led the battle, the world has to understand that protecting nuclear material is the best way, the most efficient, effective way to prevent nuclear terrorism, catastrophic nuclear terrorism. It's the hardest job for the terrorists. It's the easiest job for us. Once the material gets in the wrong hands, at that stage, every step of the way is more difficult for the good guys and easier for the bad guys. So I think it's deadly serious. Not only a nuclear detonation, but even more likely, far more likely, is a radiological weapon that wouldn't kill nearly as many people, but nevertheless could cause huge economic damage. And we're lucky that that one hadn't happened already. But we can do a lot about it, and I don't think anyone should despair. Dick Lugar's already mentioned we've gone from 50 countries that had nuclear weapons usable material to 25. Laura Holgate sitting here in the audience, she's on the National Security Council and heads up that program. President Obama has had, and President Bush before him, a great deal of emphasis on protecting nuclear material, and we are making progress. So people should not despair. There are things that can be done.
Lord Browne and Congressman Fortenberry, the same question to you too. How real is the threat? And I'd like to add, why have we not had any real incidents or close calls that we know of?
Well, I think the answer to that question is we've been very lucky. You know, and we can't have a policy that relies on luck. But I think before I answer the specific question, I mean, I think we have made enormous progress in this regard. And Ariane, in her opening remarks, I think, answered your question, actually, with respect, but about the nature of the threat and the realistic approach to it. But before answering this question, we've made enormous progress in the last couple of decades in particular, but there is still a way to go. But I can't share this platform with these two men without paying tribute to the leadership that they have shown and the United States consequently has shown in making this world a much safer place in securing these materials. I mean, we are, all of us and future generations will be much more secure from the threats of these materials falling into the hands of the wrong people, substantially because of their foresight. And if I may say, and this is obvious from my accent, this is an observation from somebody outside of the United States, their ability to work together despite their political differences on an issue that was in the interests of the United States. So they deserve an enormous amount of credit, and it is a singular honor for me, and I know the Congressman shares this, to share a platform with them on this and to be bracketed in the same place as they are, because they are genuine heroes as far as the world and the United States is concerned. But we have been lucky. You know, we know that Al-Qaeda tried to get their hands on this. We know, for example, that Daesh or ISIS are strutting their stuff at the moment in Syria, telling everybody what they managed to get out of Mosul University. Whether they did or not, I'm not sure, but you know, if they ever find, God forbid, the technological way in order to be able to translate that material into something that could create a bomb, then we will see terror, the like of which we've never seen before. We know that smugglers in Moldova in 2011 were caught with kilograms of material, probably not enough for a nuclear weapon, but never mind, certainly enough to generate a significant level of terror. You know, and the story that's already been referred to, that's on the front page of the Washington Post, has a piece to it in relation to a place called Pelindaba, which was physically attacked in 2007, and materials could have been taken. So we know this is a problem, and I just want to, for the audience and for commitment to this, put this into a different perspective. I mean, there is, by our estimation collectively, about 2,000 metric tons of weapons usable material in 25 countries, as the Senator said, and in hundreds of sites in those 25 countries, not all of them secure and not all of them well protected. Now, to put that into perspective, this is the 70th anniversary of the only use of nuclear weapons the world has ever seen, and God forbid we ever see them again. The first of those two weapons, when it exploded, killed 80,000 people and destroyed 2/3 of the city of Hiroshima. 0.7 of a gram of material released its energy to cause that damage. 0.7 of a gram. That compared to 2,000 metric tons of material is less than the weight of a dollar bill.
Congressman.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Dr. Kim, for moderating tonight, and Professor for hosting, and it is a great privilege for me as well to sit among my distinguished colleagues, former
Senators Nunn and Lugar, who have done extraordinary work and leadership in this regard, as well as my friend Lord Browne. Thank you so much for coming today. It's good to see you again. We haven't talked in a while, I guess. If I could divert for a moment, something came up relative to the university in my own house on Saturday night. I can't remember the full context of the conversation, but the whole family was gathered. I have 5 daughters, and one of my daughters said, "What is a Hoya?" So I had to reach way back. I'm an alum of the school as well, and I said, well, it's some mix of Latin and Greek, Hoya saxa, and it means what rocks. And actually went on the internet, and I confirmed what I remembered. So nonetheless, it's good to be back home, and thank you all for coming tonight. Yours is the right question, a serious question. We have made significant progress, significantly due to the leadership of Senators Nunn and Lugar, in trying to secure loose nuclear or loose materials, potential fissile materials. I'll tell you a quick story, though. There is a current sitting member of the United States Senate, and we served together in the House of Representatives. And he was an Air Force pilot during the 90s and ran mission in the Balkans. And he physically had a map in his cockpit with a red circle on a map that said, "Do not bomb here." That's how, again, problematic it is of these materials, particularly in the past, but even today, the storage of them, the potential for their theft, the potential for their loss, the potential for something to happen in some kind of conflict. So when you think about what Senator Nunn was referring to, how the technology, we're living in a time of really 2 realities. First of all, technology and information has spread, and that can cause great good, develop mutual understanding and trust through enhanced communications. But it can also be used for great harm. So the technological genie is out of the bottle. What it comes down to is securing the materials for the use in potential weapons.
The U.S., yes.
One other point here, because deterrence basically has been the policy of the United States for a long time. We have not gotten away from that. We still have deterrence. But the problem here that we have to add to catastrophic terrorism, nuclear terrorism, is that nobody quite knows how you deter a group that doesn't have a return address. That's a dimension of nuclear terrorism that is even more dangerous than states developing nuclear weapons, although the two are related. The more states that have weapons, the more likely it is that material is going to get out. So this business of how do you deter a group that is not only no return address, but maybe suicidal, is a nightmare.
It's a very important point. Thank you, Senator. The U.S. and Russia combined are home to over 90% of the world's HEU and plutonium. Now, we'll get into nuclear weapons in the second half, but as it relates to fissile material, what are the consequences of the current frosty relations between the U.S. and Russia on nuclear security work? What are the consequences of failure to provide global leadership in this area? And what can be done to fix this?
Well, let me start with the thought that with Medvedev as the leader of Russia, there were negotiations that led to the New START Treaty in 2010 and its ratification by the United States Senate, which was to reduce the warheads of the United States and Russia to 1,550 or thereabouts. But he left office. A new leader came back. And essentially, I think the notes that have been in the press recently about Vladimir Putin as he planned the Crimea invasion indicate that very clearly he was talking about the potential use of nuclear weapons if necessary, the positioning of nuclear situations vis-a-vis Poland or other countries that might be in the nearby situation. This is very current. A leader who apparently has decided of a restored Russia or a new Russia or the revival, and it includes refurbishing of the nuclear stock. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily building more weapons, But the thought of a leader and expressing this even covertly, although it comes out that these are in play, is a very different situation in the last 5 years or so. It leads then other countries who may be in harm's way to try to think, what will we do? Do we go to the United States and try to get anti-nuclear protection? And if that really doesn't work, is there any stopper? If you are determined to push on and retake territory, claiming that this was always yours to begin with and so forth. It's just a very different predicament.
I think the situation with Russia and Ukraine and the confrontation we've had is one of the most dangerous and disturbing elements since the end of the Cold War. Certainly, it's extremely dangerous. The rhetoric is being used now with Russia about nuclear weapons is, in my view, not only irresponsible but very dangerous because it sends signals that may not be intended. It may be a political type rhetoric, but one of my Russian friends said the other day, words can become deeds. And so I think this is a lose-lose-lose situation. I think it's in the long run a losing proposition for Russia because they have basically alienated much of Ukraine. They have frightened a lot of their neighbors. And so that cannot be good for Russia in the long run. Also, the question of their economic cooperation in energy matters is now much more on the table. That cannot be in their interest. Certainly a lose situation for Western Europe, where sovereignty of borders was thought to be something that had been settled at this stage. And it's a lose situation for the United States because we've already mentioned that most of the progress we've made on securing nuclear weapons material around the globe has been made with cooperation with the United States and Russia. Also after the Cold War, and this is on the good news side, we went from 4 countries with nuclear weapons, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia, to 1 country with nuclear weapons, Russia. You can imagine the situation right now if there were 4 countries in that region that still had their finger on the nuclear trigger. And when the Cold War concluded, Ukraine had a bigger nuclear arsenal than any 2 countries in the world, any countries in the world except the United States and Russia. So did Kazakhstan, bigger than China, Great Britain, and France. So the cooperation that was so essential to protect us over the last 20 years has been basically disrupted. Not ended completely. There's still a lot of mutual interest, but we have had a real setback here. The most serious part of the setback is a destruction of trust. And without trust, it's very hard to work together. We've got to find a way to put that back together, but it's got to be with the United States and Russia and other countries. It cannot be unilateral. And in my view, we ought to be having quiet discussions with the Russian leadership. Whether that's going on or not, I don't know. But we ought to be having special envoys because this is clearly a very dangerous situation. We need Russia's cooperation, not only on the nuclear front, we need Russia's cooperation with the Iranians. Russia is one of the countries that is participating in the boycott, economic boycott of Iran. And we'd be sadly mistaken if we think that the economic boycott is all the United States. Most of it is other countries. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but there are all sorts of reasons we need to have cooperation with Russia, and it's just as important that they have cooperation with us. So we're going through a phase now which is extremely dangerous.
The Department of Energy is going to save a lot of money this year, sadly, because these programs of cooperative threat reduction with the Russians are on hold, freeze, or gone, hopefully not gone, with some minor manifestations of it, I think, between the scientific communities. But the basic infrastructure of the threat reduction programs have been ceased. So that's not a good development. In fact, I've been reflecting on this, thinking that this is so critical that it should try to transcend the current tensions, and some form of public communication, perhaps to the Russian ambassador, might be in good order to revive the cooperative threat reduction programs, which are so successful in reducing materials. So that's something that I've actually been considering doing just of late, because it's so critical. There's no reason for this to go away, even in the midst of very significant tensions in other areas.
And some work, just to be clear, some work has continued between the U.S. and Russia on nuclear security work, but a substantial part of it has been put to a halt. Lord Browne, did you have anything to add?
It's just that in this whole agenda, in reducing our reliance on nuclear weapons, reinforcing non-proliferation, increasing nuclear material security, most of the rest of the world, if not all of the rest of the world, looks to Russia and the United States for leadership. And for most of the time that I've been involved in this agenda, because of the cooperative threat reduction process, because of the Nunn Lugar initiative and therefore the cooperative threat reduction process, and because of the generosity substantially of the United States in investing billions of dollars in this program, and because of bilateral discussions between these countries, we've seen progress. So we have, for example, in nuclear weapons, seen the number of nuclear weapons in the world go down from about 70,000 at the height of the Cold War to about 16 or 17,000 now. I mean, it's still far too many, and I think most people agree that it's far too many, but it's a significant reduction. And we've lost all of that, but some remnants of it, in a comparatively short period of time. But much more importantly, these two great nations, and NATO and Russia, have lost almost all trust and confidence that they had in each other. So, quite often people ask me in discussions like this, what is the most dangerous part of the world to live in? It's quite a difficult question to answer in this world at the moment, but probably in my perception it is at the moment somewhere in the Middle East. But the riskiest part of the world to live in is in the Euro-Atlantic space, because we have 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world in that space, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. And some of them are on hair trigger. Even all of these years after the end of the Cold War, we have them in relatively short readiness to fire. We have 4 of the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states in that space. And we have now, because of Ukraine, some utterly irresponsible behavior going on in terms of the way in which people are flying aircraft with transponders switched off, the way in which they're using each other's land and materials as for target practice. There are all sorts of things going on in that space. And at least when we did this in the Cold War, we had structures where people were talking to each other, and our senior military officers knew and understood each other. And they could say, don't misinterpret this because this is what we're doing. So, we have, I think, God forbid, the perfect storm being generated here of behavior in circumstances of the least trust and confidence. And I entirely agree with Congressman Fortenberry that we ought to raise this issue of common interest and discussion in relation to at least these issues. And I could add 4 or 5 other things to that list of things that we need to talk to the Russians about. But we have a set of international structures, unfortunately, that we reach for the tactic of suspension when things happen. So we set up the NATO-Russia Council to discuss these things in military terms, and when something happens where we need the Council, we suspend it from meeting. This is a form of madness.
Now, nuclear security programs so far have focused on civilian use of highly enriched uranium, but about 85% of global weapons usable nuclear materials lie outside of civilian programs, which include military programs. And we really haven't taken a serious crack at plutonium, too. How do we begin to address military stocks and plutonium?
NTI has put a lot of, our organization, Nuclear Threat Initiative, has put a lot of emphasis on that. We had what we call a global dialogue, which preceded the last 3 nuclear materials summits. Again, Laura Holgate, sitting in the audience, has had more to do with this than any one person in the executive branch. And we have made progress in this area, but the military stockpiles have been excluded as if you can presume them to be safe. That is a false assumption. That is a very false assumption. They are not really, in many cases, much better protected than civilian stockpiles. So we've got to do something about this 85% that hadn't been on the agenda. To the credit of the last Nuclear Materials Summit, and we think the global dialogue we sponsored had something to do with that. To their credit, the leaders of our countries started talking about that military material. A number of countries signed up and they're going to begin working on it. But we have a long, long way to go. And a lot of this is excess material. The ultimate paradox is that it may be that the material is safer in a weapon than it is when it's sitting out not being properly secured, because a weapon would be harder to steal. I'm not saying that weapons would be in any way safe. As Des mentioned, it's a form of madness that we in Russia still have thousands of weapons on what I call quick launch. If you say hair trigger alert, some people don't agree with that, but we would take a matter of seconds or minutes at most to launch weapons in both Russia and the United States that would destroy most of God's creation. Just a matter of minutes. So we should not be in that posture, but everything about the nuclear agenda has gotten more difficult since the Ukrainian-Russian confrontation. More difficult, but more important at the same time.
I'd like to make a follow-up point to what Lord Browne said. If you pick a fight with us, we'll fight you. But if you insult us, we'll cut off all diplomatic channels and multilateral organizations to try to solve this. It's a certain irony of governance. And you see that manifested itself quite often. So it's not exactly your point, but I think it's a good point to be made. These are the times in which you, in spite of ill will, in spite of tensions, you try to actually ramp up the potential for increased dialogue so that the outcomes, at least you've tried that outcome before any other. Regarding, I guess the distinction between military and non-military is a bigger fence and a few more guards. And this gets in a whole nother discussion about terms and definitions like strategic versus tactical as well in terms of nuclear weaponry and where did those lie. So there's a whole spectrum, obviously, of nuclear security issues here that would need to be addressed. I want to tell you a quick story, though, if I could. When I first got to Congress, I went onto the floor of the House of Representatives, and there was a vote taking place, and the security began to yell, "Run." And I said, "Run where?" And they yelled, "Run." So I ran out of the building, and I looked at the sky, and I wondered if this was my last moment, if I was going to see some type of missile that had been launched at us that would take me and the rest of this institution, the rest of this town potentially. And of course, having been raised by the Jesuits here, I hope I said my act of contrition, a good Catholic prayer. I'm trying to remember if I did or not. For our non-Catholic friends, that's a quick prayer to say, "God, I'm sorry," basically. But so I began to run, and I didn't know where to go, but I saw Rahm Emanuel running too. And I figured he knew a little bit more than I knew. So I began to run after Rahm Emanuel. And I got to the street in front of the Supreme Court, and clearly he didn't know what to do either. And there was a light there, and a young man was in a car, and I knocked on his window. I said, "I'm Congressman Fortenberry. There's some kind of a national emergency. We have to go." "Yes, sir. Where are we going?" Like a good American. The point to all of this is, as Senator Nunn was saying, the destructive power of all of this is almost hard to get the mind around. And yet we have to stare at it. We have to look it right in the face and talk about the realities of the potential destruction that could occur. When two planes hit the World Trade Center, it has changed the course, or those planes hit the World Trade Center, it has changed the course of our country for years now. Can you imagine one singular nuclear weapon going off? It's just, we have to get the mind around this.
Lord Browne.
Thanks to President Obama's initiative in relation to nuclear material security, after the last summit, the countries who attended that emerged with an agreed statement that committed themselves to the security of all nuclear materials. Now, I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not convinced, certainly, that my government understood exactly what they were committing themselves to. So I speak for my own government and not for other people's. But they committed themselves to all. Now, it is undoubtedly the case that engaging with what we now call military material, but is probably a misnomer, it's probably the wrong name for it, but there's no reason to go into a discussion about that. But what we now call military material is going to be more challenging because it cuts across the issue of individual countries' sovereignty in a much more acute fashion than material which is in civilian hands. But it is 85%. So, of course, when you engage, and when I engage with people back in London about this, they tell me, you don't need to worry about this material. This is much safer than anything else. Don't worry about it. I remind them, of course, that, and many people in this room will remember this, that 4 months after the last summit, in July, an 82-year-old nun broke into the Y-12 security complex in Tennessee, which is the most secure repository, or should have been the most secure repository of highly enriched uranium in this country.
N-U-N, Nunn.
Sorry?
N-U-N.
N-U-N.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. He's not as old as that yet. Anyway,
Have you ever tried to tell a nun no, though?
Well, I was taught by a nun, so I've got an idea how she got in. She just told the guards to stand up straight. But that's an indication. I mean, I think we can probably all share stories of where security by complacency has failed. And we need to be very careful about being convinced, and we should take steps and engage with this. And I'm proud, again, to be with these two gentlemen to my right here in a task force that is with military material experts from around the world, including Russians, and Chinese, looking at this issue to see if we can begin to address the challenges. But actually, the bilateral experience of the United States and Russia in terms of verification of treaties shows that you can allow another sovereign country to inspect and verify what you do with nuclear materials without undermining your own security or sovereignty. And the rest of the world has a lot to learn from what the United States and Russia has done bilaterally in this space. But we will need to tackle this issue of the 85%, and we will need to face down the usual nonsense that we get from military and other people about everything's fine with us, because that's not always been the case. And if we have standards for material, international standards, as we're encouraging them for material that's in the hands of civilians, then we ought, I think, to be able to tackle the issue of introducing those standards internationally, and confidence among each other that those who have it for military purposes are securing it. But they have far too much of it anyway. And my country has far too much of this material.
Let me just mention that the last trip that I took to Russia before the Russians decided to end the Nunn-Lugar Act, essentially, the people in the Foreign Office were still amenable to talking about this. There were cases in Russia where the security, even the military, what we're talking about now, was not all that secure. And United States people really were doing a lot of that security work in behalf of the Russians. And I think Russians understood that at places I went in the country. But when you get to the War Office, they were adamant that they wanted the Americans out. And they continue to pursue that. Our situation presently is one in which we really are completely out. But Ukraine has occurred. We've adopted sanctions against Russia. We've encouraged our European allies to do this, and they have responded. The Russian economy is headed down the drain. There are huge problems for the citizens of the country, even at the time that there's a patriotic surge because of the occupation of Crimea. As a practical matter, how in the world, in the midst of this, even though you talk a good game about diplomacy and getting together and sort of discussing this, the fact is, a lot of us have been discussing this. But you have a situation of the leadership of the country and the pragmatic facts of life with regard to Russia right now, that in which they are prepared to take the risk of having this stuff stolen and their own citizens harmed because they want us out. And they're very adamant about the whole picture.
Before we move on to weapons, I'd like to pose one last question to Congressman Fortenberry, because we do have the pleasure of having a sitting congressman here with us tonight. Congressman Fortenberry, we seem to be at a crossroads on where we go on fissile material security policy and spending here in the U.S. And internationally. We have the situation with Russia, which we just discussed. President Obama's budget on nuclear security hasn't been the greatest in many people's minds. There's been a reorganization in the NNSA, their whole Non-Proliferation Bureau. And so all of this creates a lot of uncertainty for the next 2 years of this administration, but more so for the next US administration. And to make matters even more uncertain and perhaps more questionable is the fact that we don't have the same kinds of champions on the Hill as we used to, Senators Lugar and Senator Nunn. So where do we go from here?
Could I interject it? Nobody has done more than
Aye,
Jeff,
here, here.
Jeff
Yeah,
to organize the caucuses. He's our leader on these issues now, and I thank him every day for that.
Thank you for your generous words, Senator. Here's what happened to me. Back again, I'm being reflective tonight on my first days in Congress, but I had 2 hearings at the same time. One on the development of nuclear weapons in Iran, and one on the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea a few years back, okay? I thought, my goodness, how am I going to split time between these 2 essential hearings? So I go to Iran, glean what I can, and I'm dashing through the hallway to get to North Korea. Now at the Iran hearing, there were just a handful of members. I get over to the North Korea hearing, again, just a handful of members. But in between, there was a huge line of people. And I stopped somebody and I said, what is this line for? So they said, oh, this is the XM-Cirrus satellite radio merger hearing. Okay, so we're talking about existential issues, the future of mankind, but nobody really has the time. So let's just figure out the radio merger. In other words, the point being is, it dawned on me fairly early that, as Senator Nunn and Lugar had done, the need to heighten, at least to heighten awareness of the nature of these problems, to have some body of expertise working on them consistently in Congress. The reason that there isn't is Congress generally responds to incentives. There aren't much incentives to do this. There aren't interest groups, if you will, behind this. It's complicated. Don't administrations take care of this? Well, ultimately, we make the law. And while our ideals should matter, the constraints of resources, particularly of time, do not empower members of Congress to invest in these essential issues. So that's, frankly, your leadership on helping pull together this tonight is our way of inviting you, the next generation, frankly, to become a part and help hopefully capture the imagination and help us think critically about a new architecture for nuclear nonproliferation so that we can bring the probability of nuclear weapons explosion as close to 0 as possible, while being realistic that we have to have a nuclear deterrent in a very broken world. We have to have strong nuclear security, but the robust architecture for nonproliferation must be rethought. These gentlemen have now passed the torch. At some point, I'll pass the torch and you all are next. So that's the idea here of establishing the nuclear working group, nuclear security working group in Congress. So and there's been good response.
Right, so the attention and the awareness is critical. The other critical component is funding to implement and carry out these initiatives and programs. What are the most effective steps that the people in the audience can take to support funding for nonproliferation and security programs?
Yeah, I'll jump right in, then I'll stop. To the other point of your question, though, when President Obama launched his nuclear security summit, I was asked to attend. And there were about 15 of us on a bus that went there. And frankly, it was the most eclectic group of members you could think of. There was no narrative thread between us. I couldn't figure it out. Then Congressman Ed Markey, who's now the senator from Massachusetts, who was also on the bus, he said, "Jeff, you figured out why we're invited?" I said, "I don't get it. What is holding this group together?" He said, "This is everyone who voted against the civil nuclear trade deal with India." There's just a handful of us. And the reasons were not anything against India, but it was the concern that the issue of nonproliferation and the spread of technology had not been adequately addressed. And so that was the binding element there. But I think that the summit was helpful and continues to be helpful in terms of securing fissile materials. There is a report coming out of the NNSA within the month, again, examining the whole architecture of the nonproliferation regime, and I would recommend that if you all continue to be interested, that we look at this. Because, again, one of the problems in government is you tend to just pick up where somebody else left off. And is that old idea still adequate to new and ever-changing circumstances?
So we are running out of time. I do want to let the audience pose the more difficult questions. But before we turn it over to the audience, we are moving into the nuclear weapons realm, and we can continue to talk about nuclear security. But I'd like to ask our speakers about North Korea. This administration, for all of its reasons, rightful reasons too, has taken on a position of not rushing into talks with every single North Korean provocation. All the while, and so they've been using sanctions and other tools to pressure North Korea to sharpen its choices. All the while, we are seeing real reports that North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles are being developed on the ground. What do we do? Are we really out of options? Or is there something we can do more proactively to curb North Korea's nuclear weapons development?
I've heard a very interesting strategic thought along those lines. You know, as the Russian problem has arisen, we've all discovered NATO again. And the fact is that the nations that abut Russia, the 5 of them, want to make certain we've all rediscovered Article 5, which says, in essence, the United States will come to the aid of those countries militarily. We're prepared to lay down our lives and fortunes to make certain that our NATO allies are not invaded and taken over. Now, there is not the same degree of certainty with regard to our allies in Asia. So at least one theory is we're not going to be able to create NATO there, but if South Korea or Japan or Australia, just to name a few, were to have the same assurance of Article 5, this, to say the least, would bring a great deal more confidence to all of them given the North Korean nuclear problem. As a matter of fact, it might bring a great deal more confidence to China, because despite the fact that the Chinese are huge, clearly North Korea has bullied them to some extent and really made life very difficult because of the nuclear program out there.
The key to North Korea, one of the keys is China. China, let's be honest, likes to keep us off balance, and having North Korea dangling out there as a wild card has been helpful to whatever their aims are in that regard. So there is some leverage and pressure that can be applied through China. Let me throw out a provocative idea, and I'm not advocating for this, but again, there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, but a joint, if North Korea continues down this pathway, a joint South Korean-American nuclear command. That's a deterrent.
One challenge with the China leverage is that in recent years, China and North Korea relations seem to have frayed, and so there are still questions as to how effective China can be in trying to persuade its traditional allies. Senator Nunn, if North Korea ever decides to abandon its nuclear stockpiles and ambitions, can a form of CTR be applied, or some type of threat reduction program be applied to the North Korea case?
Yes, I think something like the Nunn-Lugar program could be applied if you ever got North Korea to agree to give up their weapons, because clearly they would need economic assistance to do that. Getting rid of nuclear materials or getting rid of nuclear weapons themselves is a very expensive proposition. The North Koreans are destitute in terms of their economy. When I worry about various countries with nuclear weapons, I worry about North Korea more on selling the weapons than I do any other feature of it. I worry about the Iranians in terms of the effect in the region in terms of proliferation of weapons, but the North Koreans are desperately poor and may end up, if they have a chance, selling the material. That's what I worry about there. In terms of nuclear possible dangers, I worry about Pakistan and India more than any other countries because of the very large arsenals they have and proximity and very little in the way of cooperation and warning time. But the North Koreans, we have to, I guess, play the patient game now because no one wants a war with North Korea. Certainly our South Korean allies don't, the Japanese don't. China is the country that has the most economic relations. It's hard for us to leverage North Korea now because we don't have much economic contact with them anyway. And I think the fact that China's patience seems to be growing a little thin is an encouraging sign. But the United States and China need to be having very quiet discussions. It would have to be quiet on the whole question of what do we do if North Korea collapses. To me, that's a scenario that could happen. I'm not predicting it will happen, certainly not in the next immediate future. But if it does happen, what happens to the nuclear material? What happens to the nuclear weapons that they probably have produced of the crude type? What happens to the huge number of refugees? China has a big stake in this. So to me, the key to North Korea is United States, China, Japan, South Korea finding a way to work together. Japanese play a big role here too and have some economic leverage.
I'm glad, Senator, you mentioned Pakistan, and I don't want to take up more time from the audience. I would love to give the students here an opportunity to ask questions. I hope somebody will ask a Pakistan question, and an Iran question, and a Russia question, and all the others. So do we have floating mics, or are there? Okay. So let's, as Ariane had mentioned before, let's give priority to the students in the audience. If you are a student at Georgetown, please raise your hand high and pose a question. Yes. In the back, please, the glasses.
Hi, hello. My name is Maciej Lemke, and I'm a first-year graduate student at SSP. And just going back to the issue of nuclear terrorism, I guess, well, most of the discussions are focused on how to prevent that event from happening. But I was sort of thinking of how, say, if that really happened and, say, the United States would be attacked by a terrorist organization, how would then the United States respond to such an attack? I mean, I know we have measures to trace back the nuclear material, we have nuclear forensics, but I mean, even if we prove that the source comes from Pakistan, do we then attack Pakistan? What's the plan in that situation?
Right. I think the question of whether you can trace the material is a very good question. Obviously, if a government deliberately sold or leaked that material to a terrorist group and it was used, there would be a tremendous pressure and tremendous likelihood of a very strong attack. Whether it would be with conventional weapons would be a question of the military necessities, but in all likelihood, there would be very strong retaliation in some fashion. The difficulty is, how do you trace the material? How do you know where it came from? We need a global inventory with signatures on material. If we ever get the materials down far enough, and we're not there yet, getting some type of agreement internationally to have traceable signatures on material would be technologically possible, but we're a long, long way from that politically, as far as I know. We at NTI had sort of a tabletop exercise with Russians back about 3 or 4 years ago, where we basically played a scenario in Russia with an interception of nuclear material by Russian security forces in the hands of a terrorist group that was heading to the United States. And then we determined whether we could cooperate in trying to see where that material came from. And the answer was our two governments were not able to cooperate at that stage. I hope some improvements have been made, but you've got to be able to trace the material. The material will come, if an attack came in the United States, we could end up basically finding the material came from here. In that case, there'd be very little incentive to retaliate.
There was a hand in the middle here. Let's take 2 questions at a time, please. The gentleman with the green necktie and Christina up here. Let's take 2 at a time. No, with the green necktie, could you please stand up? And Christina, too, can you please stand up? Yeah.
That's the confusion. I guess I don't really. Use the mic. All right, sounds good. Okay, I guess I will ask the Iran question then. Obviously, the Iranian negotiations are in the news this week with the letter that the Senate Republicans signed. And so I guess my question to the panel would be specifically, what would an ideal, realistic agreement with Iran look like if we assume, as the Republicans don't, that Iran would follow through? And then more generally, do we need to be focusing, if our goal is complete non-proliferation of any nuclear materials, should we be focusing on cutting back on the countries that currently have nuclear materials, or should our focus be on preventing the spread of more?
Thank you. Up here, Christina. And for the Iran question, I'd like to slip in, what's the alternative to the current approach?
Hi, Christina Kim from Security Studies Program. I actually have an Iran question as well. But my question is, the Republican critics of President Obama's nuclear strategy has been that the U.S. is about to sign a very bad deal with Iran. So my question to you is the U.S. better off with a bad deal or a no deal, or is President Obama's strategy going in the right direction? Thank you.
Let's give Ariane the first crack at these 2 wonderful questions.
All right. Well, I think the most important component of a deal with Iran would be monitoring and verification, which is something that I think hasn't been emphasized enough in the discussion because so much attention has been paid to the number of centrifuges, which is sort of the visible part of the discussion. So I think ideally, a good deal, essentially, would provide the IAEA with enough access to the different facilities, and it would scale back Iran's program enough, the breakout time of about 1 year, which has been on the table for a while. And I think that the possible military dimensions, the past activities that Iran has undertaken that we know of, there needs to be some level of clarification on that eventually as well. In terms of the alternatives, I think that a number of the alternatives have been tested so far. Sanctions have been tested; they have brought Iran to the table, but further sanctions are not necessarily going to be productive at this point. In terms of a military strike, I think that it's not going to be. We don't have enough evidence that is going to scale back the program enough. It might actually reinforce the idea that Iran needs a nuclear weapon. So I think that the best possible path right now is a negotiated solution, which is what the administration is trying to do. And it seems likely that there is going to be some level of agreement in the next few months.
Gentlemen.
No, I don't have any further comment beyond yours.
I think the points have been made are good ones. To me, the maximum strength of the United States in negotiating with Iran, or for that matter in other places around the world, is if the United States leader, the president, and the Congress are working together. In the case of Iran, that's obviously not the case, and there's not trust there. That's a very serious obstacle in my view, and I think the letter was counterproductive. I'm not sure what the intent was, but I think whatever it was, it's being perceived around the globe as the United States Congress, Senate, not wanting any agreement, not wanting any negotiation. And I'd say the second ingredient of strength is the United States and our allies getting along and being on the same page, and our allies in the region are not on the same page. Israel obviously is not at this stage with the current leadership, and Saudi Arabia has big problems with any negotiation with Iran because of the many historical animosities as well as the Sunni Shiite. The third ingredient is one I want to just spend a minute on because I think it's very important. This is not simply a United States economic embargo of Iran. This is Russia, China, Britain, France, other countries, Germany, and this is a world. That's the reason we've gotten the Iranian attention. The Iranians have been building nuclear weapons since the Shah. That's where the nuclear program started. Maybe it wasn't weapon at that stage, but that's where it's come from. They've been in this business a long time. We've never gotten them to stop. Now, the thing that has gotten their attention is the economic boycott. What does that mean? It means to me, beyond verification, which is essential, beyond enforcement, which is essential, beyond the amount of uranium they continue to have, highly enriched in their country. All of those are essential, but the most essential part is, can we hold the economic coalition together? Can we hold our allies together? That, to me, is why the letter is so counterproductive, because it sends a signal that if the negotiations break off, if we don't get an agreement, that the fault was the United States. The Iranian strategy has to be to end the boycott, that we're strangling their economy. Now, if you don't have an agreement, they want to blame the United States, and the letter falls right into that, so they can break up the Allied embargo. That's what we've got to keep our eye on, and even if we get an agreement, if it's not enforceable with the Iranians, if they cheat on it, which they could, if they do, we've got to put the embargo back on unless we want a war, and I don't think we want a war with Iran. So war should at least be the last option. Now, so we've got to keep the economic embargo allies together, and that's what's being forgotten, in my view, with the letter writers. It's also being forgotten in terms of the Netanyahu speech. He never told us how we hold the coalition together, as far as I saw. I never saw that.
My comments follow on, as you would expect, specifically from this perspective. I mean, I'm still a politician in the United Kingdom, so I'm not going to interfere in domestic politics here in the United States. Well, maybe a bit, but so I'm not, but let me share a non-US perspective on this. I mean, I don't know what the alternatives, the choices question was aimed at, whether it was, the alternative to this negotiated deal that people think is emerging, or whether it was the true choices. But the choices that face us are either we learn to live with a nuclear-armed Iran, which I think is unthinkable for all of the reasons that the regional environment will generate, or we have a war with Iran in some way. Now, we haven't shown ourselves very good at being able to get out of wars in that part of the world recently, or be very clear in what we were trying to achieve by them. I'm very close to a lot of military people, and the advice I consistently get from military people across the world is there is no certainty we could do what politicians would want us to do here with military intervention, or we make a deal. I think Ariane, from my perspective, describes the principal components of a deal, although I would add that it has to be verifiable. We have to be able to verify this, and that will be the challenge. But she, I think, gives us the principal components of a deal. On this journey, and this journey, of course, started a long time ago, and I don't want to remind people here in the United States who the Shah's partner was when he started developing nuclear weapons, but you all know, right? So he didn't get this technique. I mean, as somebody once said, recently in a valedictory speech that she made about a job that she had, and I think you may have heard it. She said, like the proverbial turtle on the fence post, I didn't get here on my own. The Iranians did not get there on their own. So we have to, I think, remember the history and the effect that history has in the region. But the real success in terms of dealing with Iran has been the coalition that has been created, representing the rest of the world against them, in what we refer to sometimes as the P5+1. And that's all of the European Union states plus the nuclear weapon states. At least 2 of them also are European Union states, although they were, when I started this, I'm not entirely sure if we're still in the European Union. But so that coalition is extremely important, and that's the thing that's put the pressure on Iran. There's no question about that. You know, and sitting here in Washington, D.C., observing this current drama play out in the context of American domestic politics, I have a view as to what I think is the driving force behind it. But almost everybody that I speak to beyond in that coalition, whom I speak to regularly, is stunned by the fact that there is an impression here that somehow this is between the United States and Iran, and the rest of us are bit-part players in this. We're not. You know, we're crucially important to the world's ability to be able to deliver the conclusion that we all want. And all I ask is that Americans' domestic politics is aware enough of where it is in the world and its responsibilities to behave in a way that gives us leadership, I accept that, but respects us. And if the rest of us take the view that we cannot trust the United States, and if we, your staunchest ally, cannot trust the United States to enter into these sorts of discussions with us and others and come out in good faith, if we all leave that room together with a deal and we find that for domestic or other political reasons, the United States says we do not want this deal, this will have dramatic consequences for the United States' relationships with its natural partners and those others whom it needs to deal with to face up to all of the other threats we face in this world. And I just remind you that every single national security strategy of every country in the world that has one says that terrorism is the greatest threat that we face. And that every single leader in military and security terms in every single one of those countries tells their domestic audience that they can't solve this problem alone. We all need each other. So please stay with us in terms of this great difficulty that we have, because it's taken us a long time to get to this point of being able to work together, and we throw this baby out with the bathwater with a degree of trepidation, and the consequences will be significant for all of us.
Let me add a quick point about American domestic politics. Despite the letter, which was a mistake, there has been activity by Senator Corker, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Menendez, the ranking member, and they have close to a bipartisan majority that would not only pass at least legislation dealing with this treaty when it finally comes to them, and they want to have hearings, put this before the American people, but could even override the president's veto, as I understand it. So it is unfortunate the letter has obscured this constructive bipartisan area. We've talked tonight, where are we going to get the leadership, really, to deal with these problems? And I would say I'm encouraged that Corker and Menendez and others really have picked up the ball.
Congressman Fortenberry.
It's such an important question. I'll weigh in as well. But since you were a bit shy about weighing into our domestic politics, should we talk about Scottish independence?
Please. I'm sorry.
We'll have another forum on that.
I'll probably fall asleep if it's that.
A few years ago, I asked the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, agency, who has done a fantastic job, I think. What don't you know about Iran? He said, that's my problem. What don't you know? So the key to this fragile agreement would be verification. It really is the key. Now, unpacking the issue a little bit further, because the questions were excellent. Why is Iran motivated to do this? Clearly, Congress has ramped up sanctions, the administration, along with Congress pushing, and the international community. There is new Iranian leadership who is mildly probing some new pathway with the international community, and this is a manifestation of that. The international coalition, as Lord Browne so rightfully pointed to, has been a key factor here. And it includes partners like China, who are fairly new, I think, to this type of international cooperation. And the fourth factor that is real is this collapse of oil prices. So they're hurting and somewhat motivated. Now, back to the point of what does a deal or non-deal look like? You don't have a deal, well, I guess you continue along the same pathway. Iran inches closer to nuclear weapons capability. That's probably their choice. Maybe they get into what was formerly called a zone of immunity, where they can have it quickly, but they don't have it, so playing it both ways. You get an agreement that by the terms that are now being laid out, at least discussed domestically, it's not going to be perfect. It sets up some ability to contain the current trajectory toward nuclear weapons capability, if it's verifiable. And of course, that buys time, hopefully, for more responsible engagement by the Iranians in the international community, and then further backing away from this precipice of nuclear weapons capability. The fourth option was that we hold out hope that some better agreement through increased sanctions, through a more robust international coalition, comes together. That one's tougher, I think. The fourth is the war option.
There are a few more hands that I saw. Does somebody have a question that's not Iran related? If that's possible tonight. We've got a hand here. Does anybody else have a question? And one here. Could you please stand up and we'll collect both questions together.
Hi, my name is Joel Meredith. I'm in the Security Studies program. We're talking about the confluence of terrorism and the spread of nuclear weapons and materials. Could you discuss how our priorities have changed in the last 10 years, focusing more on terrorism, possibly focusing less on monitoring the exchange of nuclear materials, and if you think those priorities are going to shift in the future, as well as, like we talked about, the budget, is that, are we going to need to reprioritize more money to focus on how we can stop the spread of those materials?
Right here. Okay, thanks. Right here.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering a question. Can you hear me here?
Yes. Your name?
Quentin Fizazzi. Yeah, I was wondering, do you think on a long-run perspective that it's possible to maintain and guarantee non-proliferation, given that the handful of countries that currently have the nuclear weapons are not willing to give them up? Is it something that could last, I mean, on 100 or 200 years from now?
On the first one about priorities, the question of priorities, I don't think it's any question since 9/11. We've put a lot more priority on terrorism. We've had a lot more intelligence sources aimed at terrorism. We've done a lot more on trying to secure nuclear material, as we've talked about. We have done more on the biological side, though not nearly enough. We've done some on the radiological side, dirty bomb, not nearly enough. And we've worked with Russia and other countries to enforce the chemical weapon treaty. But the way I see it very broadly, we're in a new era because states no longer have a monopoly over weapons of mass destruction and disruption. So chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological, but also cyber. Huge damage can be done on the cyber side, as we all know. The problem is in the new era, if you're a military planner, yes, we have a new era, and the fact that there's no monopoly by states and individuals and groups can cause this kind of damage, which is unprecedented in history, but we are also carry over the old era. The old era hadn't gone. We still have the problems with Northeast Asia. We still have the problems with Russia, Ukraine, NATO challenges. So the whole spectrum of military challenges is still possible. This makes prioritization very, very important. It makes, for instance, a review of our nuclear modernization program very important. We're now about to embark on modernizing all 3 legs of the nuclear triad, which is enormously expensive as a 30, 40-year commitment. So that is very important. Everything about our military budget is difficult now. It's going to take the best thinkers, and we frankly have never been more in need of having congressional hearings on the House side and the Senate side, basically showing the American people the difficult choices we have to make so that we have more sustainability of whatever course we embark on.
Yeah, well, these are difficult questions. I'll take the easy one. 200 years, because none of us will be around to know whether I was right or wrong. So I can give you a very specific answer to that with numbers. But I think on this issue of proliferation, I mean, I'm an optimist about this. I mean, I may not sound it in the context of this discussion, but I remind you that, you know, President Kennedy, before the Non-Proliferation Treaty was agreed, warned the people of this country and the world that there would be, by the end of the century, 40 countries with nuclear weapons. I mean, that was a realistic expectation from the perspective of the early 1960s. It proved not to be correct, and the reason why it proved not to be correct is because the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in my view, is the most successful treaty the world has ever entered into, and we should protect this treaty. You know, we treat it with a degree of carelessness, those of us from nuclear weapon states, but we really need to protect this treaty. The vast majority, in excess of 170-odd countries in this world, have stuck to this treaty and not sought nuclear weapons. And some of them had the capacity to do it and gave it up. South Africa, Brazil, the countries that spilled out of the Soviet Union when it disintegrated gave up their weapons. I know there's a conversation now about whether Ukraine served their own security about that, but there is no possibility that at that time we would have allowed them to keep those weapons. Russia wouldn't, and nor would the United States. They would have been taken off them if they hadn't given them up. And the United States gave them billions of dollars in compensation. It wasn't, with respect, our fault that their leadership stole that money and corruption over time. But so, you know, we should not be pessimistic about our ability to be able to hold that grand bargain together. And there are 2 threats to that bargain, in my view, from my perspective. One is countries like North Korea and potentially Iran and others, but the nuclear weapon states are a threat to it themselves because they have not stood in behind strongly enough their commitment to disarm. And they are alienating many other countries who have no intentions of having nuclear weapons in this treaty, frustrating, alienating, and irritating them. And come April at the review conference in New York, we will see this play out again. So we move in always at these review times to, you know, crisis in the NPT. We will move into crisis in the NPT, but one time this crisis will become a reality and people will emerge, and we will emerge with a broken treaty. So we have to be very careful. You know, the people who agreed this treaty had enormous foresight, and we should protect the legacy that they have left with us, and that involves us all in having a responsibility for it. In relation to the issue of, you know, of these materials, terrorism, other challenges that we face, it does strike me as odd that every country in the world has at the top of its nuclear security strategy a #1 threat from terrorism, and yet you can move from that to spending literally trillions of dollars across the world on strategic nuclear weapons, which have no relevance at all to any aspect of the #1 strategic threat. You know, I mean, I was a minister in our government in 2005 when the heart of our city, London, was attacked, and we had to respond to that. And, you know, it was a challenge of resilience more than almost anything else for our great city. You know, and within weeks of the attack that was successful, we had another attack, which, because the terrorists used the wrong part of the separation process in order to make the bomb didn't work. But we were very lucky, or it would have happened again. But was a resilience challenge to us. You know, and much of that terrorism that we spend lots of money dealing with is more of a resilience challenge. But the confluence of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism is utterly terrifying. We haven't gone into bio or chemical challenges here, but this man here could give you nightmares for the rest of your life describing the nature of the bio challenges that we could have if these two things came together. You know, so, I mean, I look around this room at lots of young people. There are people here who have, in leadership terms, put us on the right road in relation to nuclear weapons, materials, and others. You know, and that clip you saw at the beginning with those 4 great men coming to the conclusion that we needed to reduce the numbers of weapons, we needed to reinforce non-proliferation, we needed to increase nuclear material security, had the right recipe, and that is still the right recipe for nuclear materials. But we need to apply some thinking from future generations to some of the other challenges that we face. You know, if somebody drives a lorry load of spores of anthrax into, you know, a major city and takes the top of that lorry off and lets those spores come, then we will really see terror. We need to be really, really careful about these issues. And those of you who are studying these issues and engaging with the challenges, then those will be the challenges that you will face in years to come. But they are controllable, and we can secure ourselves against them. But we certainly, from my perspective, need to divert our resources from these great weapon systems of the previous century to deal with the challenges that we face now. And if we don't do that, we won't be able to protect ourselves from them.
Congressman.
Right quick, to the first question, I think the end of the Cold War really diminished the intensity of worry domestically about nuclear weapons. And again, we assumed that Russia would become Eurocentric, lean our way. And with treaty reductions and strategic nuclear weapons, it seemed to be progressing well. We assumed their economy would liberalize and democratic reforms would take hold. And we just moved on with business. And then 9/11 came, and the whole prospect of a non-state set of actors using, in effect, new forms of weaponry captured, rightfully so, understandably so, our need and desire to defend ourselves and to rethink our security model. So I think those were the 2 primary factors that perhaps led to maybe a diminishment of the emphasis on nuclear materials, nuclear weapons, although good work continued throughout this time. To the other question, I think the broader, again, to use the word architecture of moving forward, would focus on, and again, the realistic possibility of this politically is not yet here, but we hold out hope for the ideal. An inventory of all material, standards for security and traceability. Then you've got your arms around what is out there and where it is and who has it fully. And then that way it can be negotiated, controlled, and the prospects for loose material, the prospects for belligerent behavior with it would hopefully diminish.
I'd just like to add a footnote to that very thoughtful comment of the Congressman. It seems to me if you get the inventory, you get the list, and then the question for students here, and this may be in the course of several years of time, but hopefully there will be enough of us who will have studied each of the countries that are involved, each of the countries that now have weapons. Take the South African case that the Washington Post discussed. Here, this is going to require extraordinary diplomacy, but it's potentially doable. I'm convinced that the leadership of that country at some point may be persuaded that they really don't need to have that material around, and not much of it. And that would be true of other countries. It may be, in other words, a country-by-country analysis, quite apart from a world scheme in which a broad coalition comes together. But it will require a lot of people who know something about each of these countries. To talk about it blandly and something discussed in statistics doesn't really get to the heart of the negotiations, the conversations, the persuasion that is going to have to occur here.
Could I mention one other
Yes.
point on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because I think it's very important. I agree with Des's analysis. Very, very successful treaty in many respects. But there is one area that is a glaring challenge for the next generation, and that is the right of countries to peaceful nuclear technology. The trick here is, though, that low-enriched uranium, which is used for all sorts of legitimate purposes, including power, is the same technology and enrichment that produces highly enriched uranium, which can make a bomb. And that technology is basically permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, not going to bomb making, but enriching. At some point, the other way to make weapon usable material is plutonium, which is reprocessing. At some point, I think your generation of young people is going to have to get with your counterparts around the globe and say, we've got to address this big gap in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In my own view, we're going to have to take all reprocessing and all enrichment and have it under camera, under the, not control, but under at least the oversight of an international organization, IAEA or some other organization. That would be a huge step politically, and I'm not saying it's about to happen. I don't even know that the United States would be willing to do that now. But at some point, we have to make sure if we're going to use nuclear for the benefit of mankind rather than destroying God's universe, we've got to control the enrichment and the production of nuclear material in the sense of making sure it is not in any way diverted to military purposes. So that's a challenge. In fact, I would say the challenge to young people on a lot of these issues is to get with your counterparts around the globe. Know more about them, to Dick Lugar's point, know more about the countries. Get with the Chinese young people, get with the Russian young people, get with the Iranian young people at some point, the Arab young people, and certainly the Israeli young people, and learn more about where they're coming from. This is a huge challenge, and I think our generation hasn't done nearly enough in that regard.
And that's a perfect segue to the last part of tonight's discussion. Because we are down to the wire, if I could ask all of our panelists to make your 10-second pitch. 10 seconds. Now, you are all familiar with sound bites and how the news works. Your 10 short sound bites. 10 seconds is very long for news, too. 10-second pitch to the audience. As it relates to nuclear issues and nuclear security, what can they do to help? Congressman Fortenberry, you're on.
Capture the moment, capture the imagination, and create a new movement. Humanity, the future of civilization is at stake.
That's great, Lord Browne.
Well, everybody in this room that I can see who is not of my generation lives in a virtual world.
10 seconds, remember that. 10 seconds. It's 5 already.
That's it.
It's a world of no borders. Yeah. Use it to do what Senator Nunn has suggested.
Senator, would you like to add something? Or?
The Senate does not have a 2-minute rule or a 10-second rule. So I defer to Dick Lugar. I've said enough.
Just say simply, learn more.
Learn more. Okay, that was under 2 seconds.
Which brings me to mine. Take our classes.
Take her class.
Take my class.
Take her class. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman Fortenberry, Lord Browne, Senator Nunn, Senator Lugar, and Professor Tabatabai. I always get it wrong. I'm sorry for that. For your profound and deep insights today in this discussion. I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to leave it at that. So if you once again can join me in a round of applause.